Good morning, students. Now we will go through the steps in conducting a cohort study. These are the steps of a cohort study. First step is selection of study sample or study cohort or exposure cohort. Study cohort or exposure cohort can be selected either from the general population or from special category of population. All people in the study cohort is exposed to a specific risk factor or an etiological agent. They are not affected by the disease under study. So, all those in the study cohort or exposure cohort are investigated to be free from the disease at the beginning of the study itself. Second is collection of data on exposure to risk factors. Information about exposure to risk factors may be obtained from cohort members through personal interviews or mailed questionnaires. Okay. Information about exposure to risk factor are collected from the exposure cohort. Review of records. Dose of radiation, type of surgery, medical treatment, whatever exposure, we can check from personal interview or through review of records. Medical examinations and investigations can be done to check for blood sugar level, blood pressure, cholesterol level, like that. Environmental surveys can be done for studying the exposure to risk factor in the environment. Third step is selection of comparison cohort or control cohort or comparison group. Comparison groups are not exposed to the risk factor. So sometimes we can select comparison group or control group by internal comparison. Internal comparison means comparison between groups of smokers based on the amount of exposure. Sometimes heavy smokers we can select as exposure cohort and mild smokers or uh, uh, yeah, not heavy smokers can be taken as comparison group or control group. That will be an example of internal comparison. Comparison between groups of hypertensive patients based on level of hypertension. So severe hypertension can be taken as exposure cohort and mild hypertension can be taken as control cohort. That's an example of internal comparison. External comparison means a cohort of smokers will be compared with non-smokers. Okay, a cohort of radiologists who are exposed to radiation more will be compared with a cohort of ophthalmologists who are not exposed to radiation. Third type of comparison is that comparison with general population rates. Example, frequency of cancer among asbestos workers can be compared with the frequency of cancer in general population. That is an example of comparison with general population rate. Now, fourth step is follow-up. Follow-up of both exposure cohort and control cohort. Regular follow-up of both study cohort or exposure cohort and comparison cohort or control cohort is a must in a cohort study. So it is known as follow-up study or longitudinal study. Follow-up is also done by periodic medical examination, review of medical records, home visits, telephone calls, or mailed questionnaires. Okay, these are the methods. Medical examination, review of records, home visits, or mailed questionnaires, or telephone calls. Analysis. Incidence rate among exposed group and incidence rate among non-exposed group can be calculated. exposed group or exposure cohort, and a non-exposed group or control cohort. Incidence rate of disease is calculated in both the groups. Okay, in this example, one group is exposure cohort is cigarette smokers. Okay, they are known as study cohort. 7,000 cigarette smokers and 3,000 non-smokers were included in this study. Among 7,000 cigarette smokers, 70 developed lung cancer in a follow-up. Among 3,000 non-smokers, only 3 developed lung cancer during the follow-up. Incidence rate among exposed group will be calculated 70 out of 7,000 because out of 7,000 smokers, 70 people developed lung cancer, right? So 70 divided by 7,000 multiplied by 1,000. So incidence rate is calculated per 1,000 only. So 10 per 1,000 is the incidence rate of lung cancer among smokers. Incidence rate of lung cancer among non-smokers is calculated 3 out of 3,000. So 3,000 non-smokers were there, only 3 developed lung cancer, right? So 3 divided by 3,000 multiplied by 1,000. So 1 per 1,000. So incidence rate of lung cancer among non-smokers is 1 per 1,000. Now we can calculate relative risk. Relative risk is otherwise known as risk ratio. It is the incidence of disease or death among exposed group divided by incidence of disease or death among non-exposed group. Here, incidence of lung cancer among smokers is 10 per 1,000. Okay, incidence of lung cancer among non-smokers here is 1 per 1,000. So, relative risk will be 10 divided by 1. So, relative risk is 10. Relative risk shows the strength of association between smoking and the development of lung cancer. Relative risk of 1 shows that incidence of disease among those exposed to risk factor is the same as those who are not exposed to that risk factor. So relative risk of 1 means the risk of development of disease among exposed group will be same as risk of development of disease among non-exposed group. Relative risk more than 1 shows that incidence of disease among those exposed to risk factor is higher than incidence of disease among those who are not exposed to that risk factor. The risk is high among exposed group. Okay. Relative risk of less than 1 shows that incidence of disease among those exposed to risk factor is lower than those who are not exposed to that risk factor. There is a protective effect among those exposed to the risk factor. Now we can see how to calculate attributable risk. Attributable risk is calculated by this formula. Incidence of disease among exposed group minus incidence of disease among non-exposed group divided by incidence of disease among exposed group multiplied by 100. Attributable risk is calculated as percentage. Here, incidence of disease among exposed group is 10 per 1,000. Incidence of disease among non-exposed group is 1 per 1,000. So the formula is 10 minus 1 divided by 10 multiplied by 100. So equal to 9 divided by 10 multiplied by 100. So it is 90%. So we can say that 90% of occurrence of lung cancer can be attributed to cigarette smoking. Attributable risk shows how much proportion of the total risk of development of disease is due to the particular risk factor. Okay, here 90% of the risk of development of lung cancer is due to cigarette smoking. So attributable risk is 90%. Thank you.